If you've ever walked into a room where two people were arguing and you didn't even hear them, but you could sense it, like you knew that there was a fight there. Well, guess what? How we portray ourselves, people know if we're having that bad day, if we're having a frustrating day. People can see and sense our emotions because of things called mirror neurons. So when we think about the decisions that we make or those different behaviors each and every day, how I choose to portray myself, how I choose to feel, how I choose to act and manifest the behaviors that might be underlying that sort of emotional context or, the idea context, that is going to have an impact not only on me, but the person sitting across from me. And then their reaction is going to have an impact on me. And then my reaction is going to have an impact on them.
Hello and welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. We're here to help you navigate life while disrupting the status quo. Our discussions cover a number of topics relevant to everyday life. We discuss everything from relationships to entrepreneurship. We also engage in some difficult but important conversations. And now, here are your hosts, Brian and Tanya Hamilton.
Welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. Today, we are joined by Jay Johnson. Jay, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Tanya. I'm glad to be here with you.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you. And I guess we'll start off by launching every podcast episode the way we do by asking, who is Jay Johnson?
Well, I am a behavioral scientist. I study psychology, neuroscience, and communication, all very fancy ways of saying, why do people do what they do? And I try to help organizations, governments, as well as nonprofits, try to navigate the challenges of behavior in the workplace and also at home.
So I'm curious to know, what was it that made you kind of interested in this career path? Was this like always a long plan, or is this something that kind of just happened organically?
Oh, you're getting into some history now. All right. So, they say that research is really me search. And a lot of what I was doing was trying to find answers to my own behavioral questions. What made me do the things I was doing? How did I choose one set of how did I land where I was landing? What was I doing to be different or anything like that? So on some level, my curiosity, I guess, would have been self-awareness to start off with. And then when I started sharing some of the different findings that we had come across or some of the new studies or different fascinating things, people were really, really interested in it. So it was like, all right, well, I'm not the only person that has these questions, but in terms of speaking, it was actually kind of by accident. I've always been a performer. I liked the stage and I was a debater in college, as I had mentioned to you, but so I liked public speaking. It was really enjoyable. And I did a training program at Wayne State University to help new students connect with their faculty better. And it ended up being very, very successful. And one of the faculty members comes over, puts his hand on my shoulder and says, "Jay, you're pretty good at this. You should do this for a living." And I was like, okay, I will. So that was how I got started. And I just started speaking ever since.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing that you were getting those results so early on. So how do you think everything that you were interested in really contributed to you being so effective in what you do now? And I'm thinking primarily of the debating and how that ties in.
Yeah, so debate definitely helps, but you look back through your life and you always wonder, like, what was it that got me to this point here? There's so many different things. I had a great education from Wayne State University because of debate. I was a hockey player before that. I was just a dumb hockey player that intended to be a dumb hockey player my entire life. My parents were cruel and they never told me that I'm actually only 5'8.5". So I wasn't going to make the pros, but I went pretty far. But like the teamwork and the leadership and the camaraderie learned through those experiences. Debate as something that, I'm a hyper competitive person, as you can probably tell by hockey and competitive debate, mixed martial arts career tossed in there somewhere at one point. But I wanted to understand that competition drive that I had, that desire to get up all the time and, work and do fun stuff and just always be on the go. And, I would say that those really contributed to the formative years of my speaking career. And then it was audiences actually that really kind of took me the next step, because what I found was interacting with them or helping somebody when they had that aha moment, when they had that, oh my gosh, I haven't thought about it this way, or I didn't know that my behavior came from that type of environment or from that scenario. That was one of those things where it was just one of the most rewarding experiences of my entire life. So I just wanted to keep going and keep going. And my competitive drive, of course, comes back into play. Let's do that again. That was fun.
Nice. And you tried to kind of skip over something there, your mixed martial arts career. Let's unpack that a little bit, because you really piqued my interest there.
Yeah. So, well, I played hockey up until about the age of 19. I played all the way up to the junior levels. And being a very small person on the ice, the other team didn't know that. I was incredibly physical and I was just the meanest. I was as mean as a hornet out there. So they thought I was a lot bigger. And then when that was done, and I chose to go down a path, I couldn't do both debate and hockey. And I made a calculated decision that getting my education was probably the best option for me. So I left hockey, the physical world, and went into debate, where it was much more cerebral and, argumentation. But there was still that inkling of physicality that I was missing. And my brother was an airborne ranger. He was actually, when he had gotten out, he had started his own studio and he was doing mixed martial arts with a number of different practitioners from the area. And he invited me one weekend and I came in and I showed a little bit of proficiency, and that was enough to kind of get me hooked. So I started training with them, and I never really actually did anything with a mixed martial arts career other than get punched in the face a few times. But, it was really an enjoyable experience, I guess. I don't know how to explain it, but so we had some fun with it, but I did get to help some actual amateur fighters move up and train. And mostly I was a great punching bag. I can take a lot of beatings, which is also why I've been really decent at dealing with difficult people, which is often, what gets me talked to. So that's fun.
There you go. So, okay, let's go back to the difficult people. So behavioral elements. Before we get into everything else, introduce us to the program and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so behavioral elements is something that had been years in the making for us. And every time, it's almost like a game, right? Like every time you unlock a new treasure chest, you feel like your character's gotten a little more knowledge, a little more experience, a little more treasure. And it was just these series of different things that we finally kept unlocking and like, hey, wait a second, look at this. Look at how this interacts. And one of the instrumental pieces of it was actually when we had come across a book by two Harvard faculty, Paul Lawrence and Nitin Noria. And they had studied the drives, the underlying core drives of behavior. And when they had produced that book, this was, in the early 2000s, one of the things at the end of that book said, one day somebody's going to be able to map the drives and be able to measure them. And that's really where behavioral elements comes in. So, their position, and they studied anthropology and sociology and neuroscience and psychology in this interdisciplinary study. And they found four core human drives: the drive to acquire, which is like our hunter and gatherer sense, the drive to bond, which is our connecting with people, our collaboration, our consideration for others, our drive to defend, our ability to, take and make sure that we're not being too risky. And these all link back to our survival, evolutionary survival. And then the last one, the drive to learn. That is really our curiosity, creating fire and the wheel and tools to make our lives just a little bit easier. So those core drives are really at the motivational level of most of our behaviors. And so this is not a personality assessment. It's actually really kind of measuring those intrinsic motivators beneath the surface. So behavioral elements was a way for us to categorize that and say, okay, well, what is it that's driving forces behind people's behavior? And when we started to utilize the assessment that we developed, we ended up finding that it was really just spot on with a number of people. And we tested it actually across about 19 different countries and cultures. And the feedback that we would get was just like, I've never felt seen the way that I've felt seen by this program, or this really helps me to explain why I'm choosing to do this, or why this was the career that was so attractive to me, or why I didn't do this and now I resent it and feel guilt because of it. So we use the behavioral elements to help people understand where they're at. And it's really nice because it applies both professionally and personally.
Interesting. So it applies both professionally and personally. And I'm finding that more and more with the conversations we have across a broad spectrum of topics. You know, when you talk about leadership, a lot of the same principles apply in both the personal and professional environment.
Yeah, you know, if we even think about all the things that somebody says, when you say, hey, what are the key traits that you want in a leader? They always say honesty, integrity, empathy, listening, strong communication skills, so on and so forth. But if I were to ask you, like, what do you want in a lifelong partner? You're probably going to say some of those things. And if not, if you're like, you know, I want somebody who's going to ignore me all the time. Probably not the case, right? So to be human is to be human, and to behave, whether we're behaving in a personal context or a professional context, those behaviors have results and consequences. They can be pro-social consequences. They can be negative consequences. They can be, you know, just kind of mundane consequences. But what we come at it from is behavior is a choice. Your personality is really not changing after the age of 6 by most psychological research, but how we choose to behave, or how the behaviors come out of that personality, it's so empowering to think that we actually get to choose the behaviors that we do. So that is really what we focus on, is helping people to choose better behaviors, whether it's personal or professional.
Now, in terms of, you know, some of what you've kind of highlighted, in all of these situations, we do encounter people who may not be easy for us to deal with. We'll call them difficult people.
Sure.
And you know, in life, we just have to deal with these situations. Like, if you work with somebody who's difficult, unless you're going to change your job, you're going to have to figure out how to work with that person. Same goes for school. And even if you change, you may encounter another difficult person. The odds are you will encounter another difficult person there. So I guess the question I really want to ask is, how do we deal with difficult people?
Oh, the $1 million question, right? And actually, it's a $22 billion question, because a lot of the research suggests that literally companies are dumping billions of dollars because of conflict, failed projects, because of loss of talent within the workspace. And right now, we know that talent's at a premium. So, I mean, that's really the $1 billion question. But I do think it's funny in exactly what you said, Brian, because whenever I start my dealing with difficult people talks, I always start by asking the question, how many of you in the audience are dealing with a difficult person? And of course, almost, if not all of the hands go up. And I say, well, if your hand didn't go up, then you are somebody's difficult person, right?
Exactly.
But if I was to wrap it up into one gigantic answer, my answer is this: it's your heart attack, and somebody else's bad behavior should not be the cause of your heart attack. So when we think about dealing with difficult people, I can't control somebody else's behavior. I can't make them do so. It would be illegal, and I would be put in jail if it was like, the physical, I'm just going to tie your hands behind your back so that way you don't come into my office and bug me anymore. That's, illegal. So the only thing that we do have control over is ourselves. Now, it's really hard to control yourself when somebody is being a jerk or anything else. So we look at some of the tactical applications of how can we maintain control over our own emotions, actions, behaviors, even in the face of some of those exceptionally difficult challenges.
Okay. And so I'm going to take it back to like dealing with children, right? Because as you're talking, I'm like, you know what? It's interesting because, the kids will come and be like, oh, so-and-so in the class, we don't get along. Or, you're at the park. Oh, I didn't get along with this person. And, sometimes my answer would be like, okay, well, just don't play with them, right? Or just don't interact with them if it's not working well. But then I don't know how long it's been, but lately it's been like, you know what? The reality is, you're going to be around people that you don't get along with, and you may not like, and they may not like you. for the rest of your life, right? So let's just figure out how to make this work. Yeah, maybe you're not going to be best friends with them, just like if you're at work and the coworker is that person, right? But you do have to figure out how to interact and sort of work parallel, right? Whether you're on the playground or you're an adult in the office. So that's the tricky part. I think a lot of people almost go straight into, oh, that person's difficult, I'm just going to ignore them. But like, you can only do that for so long if they're somebody you see quite regularly, right?
And Tanya, that's such a sophisticated way to look at it. And I think if more people were to take a look at it and take a step back, we would have a lot less conflict. Because here's the reality is two children on the playground that don't get along. It's much easier for us as adults to look and say, those children are probably not monsters. I mean, maybe they behave poorly sometimes, but they're not monsters. They're not terrible people. They haven't developed that yet. But we think as adults, oh gosh, that Sally down the hall, she is just a monster. And we label them rather than necessarily labeling their behaviors. So we immediately draw this picture of Sally the monster. Well, no, of course, I'm not going to take time to understand why Sally's doing something. Of course, I'm not going to ask questions to say, Sally, how might we be able to get along more effectively in the future? We both have to come to this office every single day. Your heart attack and my heart attack's probably not worth this. And if we take that step back and sometimes ask questions, that can be a really powerful way for us to start approaching these difficult behaviors or difficult people or difficult situations. And I whenever I'm doing one of my talks, I share this story, and I hope this is not too gross of a story. So bear with me. I'm not going to go really bad here, but when I was playing junior hockey, I saw one of the most sophisticated acts of behavior I ever seen. It was following one of the least sophisticated acts of behavior I've ever seen. We had a bench clearing brawl, and everybody's out on the ice and they're fighting with each other. And one of the guys on my team, and names have been removed and scrubbed, so that way we don't, really disparage somebody, but he actually bit his opponent's ear. Like, this is pre-Mike Tyson, so I don't know where that behavior came from, but he bit the other person's ear and did it in a very, very vicious way. And it was less than 2 weeks later, we're sitting in the locker room, we're getting dressed, we're, tying our skates, we're laughing, that the door to the locker room opens up. And in comes this gentleman who still has bandages on his ear. He had been traded to our team. So now you're talking about a situation where the whole room goes silent. I mean, just silent. Like, everybody's looking down, trying to avoid the situation. Like, nobody wants to deal with this. Well, before we went out on the ice that day, that person walked over to the person who had bit his ear and said, 2 weeks ago, we were enemies. Moving forward, we have to be friends. I have to trust you and you have to trust me. So after this, let's go grab a beer. Let's talk this out and get it out of the way. For a 19-year-old to do that was pretty impressive. Like, I didn't even realize, all of us sighed this gasp of relief, but in some cases, it's really the first person that takes that action, then all of a sudden opens the doorways for better actions to follow. That could have been a really bad situation. And he resolved it by being a much bigger adult than any of the rest of us were in that locker room up to that point.
And it's interesting, right? Because like you said, you don't know what that other person's reaction is going to be. Very mature of him to do that. But the reality is, a lot of people would almost freeze, I guess, in that situation, right? Like conflict. And I guess this is why I personally enjoy having these conversations, because it's so helpful on so many levels to learn just different ways, one for the communication piece and dealing with different stress and conflict. Because the reality is, it's very uncomfortable for, I would say, the majority of the population. And when it's uncomfortable, what do? We just ignore. And then
Exactly.
that doesn't help either, right?
Yeah. I always use that story as sort of my precursor of whatever problem you're having with somebody at work. If they haven't bit your ear off, then at that point in time, there's a way through that conflict.
It's
So
fixable.
that's right. But we oftentimes, you're absolutely right, Tanya. We get afraid. We're, oh, I don't want to have this difficult conversation. I don't want to think about this person. I don't. But in the meantime, all of the stress, the cortisol, the adrenaline, the fear, the anxiety is literally just creating immunocompromisation from ourselves. It's causing our metabolisms to slow down. It's making us miss work for being sick or just avoiding. And in reality, if we look at the impacts of all of that, can we ask ourselves, is that worth it? Is my heart attack worth not having this conversation? And we flip the mental script at that point and say, no, this conversation needs to happen. I need some tactics or some tools in order to be able to address these types of underlying conflicts.
Now, one thing that you mentioned is that we can choose our behavior. Now, I know there's probably people, in this conversation right now who are thinking, I am who I am, right? I can't change who I am. Do you think really deep down that we can change who we are?
So when I had, I'm going to answer that in the way that I had actually written it up. So I am a contributor to Forbes magazine, and I wrote an article said, can a tiger change its stripes? The provocative question of, can we actually change our inner nature? A tiger, the hunter, the, whatever. Well, if you've ever been to a Vegas show and you see the tigers licking their handlers or doing funny stuff, standing up on it, well, does that actually change the nature of the tiger? Of course not. And Siegfried and Roy found that the hard way when one of them did eventually turn on them. But the point of the matter is that those tigers have learned or have been conditioned that if I act in a certain way, that I receive better food, I receive better resources, I'm treated differently. And really that becomes the question of, can we choose behaviors that create better resources for us, better relationships? But even if, and so I tell this funny story, and please do not, if you don't already, please don't think me a monster. I told you I'm a competitor. During the time of the pandemic, I taught my nephew, he's 10 years old, how to play chess. Okay. So we were playing this game of chess. And of course, I beat him every time. I am merciless. There is no letting him win. You got to get good, kid. That's your only chance. Well, one day I was over there and I was texting while I was playing him. By the way, a great commercial for no texting and driving because I was distracted. And sure enough, I made a mistake and he saw it and he moves his queen. And in that very moment, I started to get like this tenseness in my throat, like my palms started to sweat. We were sitting outside and I could feel these beads of sweat. And I'm like, there's inside of me on one level, I'm going, Jay, it's a game with your 10-year-old nephew. The world championship is not on the line here. But like I had these thoughts of, what if I just stood up real quick and bumped the board and, oh, I guess we got to start over, kids. Sorry. In that moment, I had a choice. I could act upon those emotions, those feelings, those thoughts, my drive to acquire, the fire element in our behavioral elements. I could have done exactly what those base level motivations were. Or I could take a step back and say, you know what? This is a perfect opportunity to build my nephew's confidence, to lift him up, to engage my drive to bond more so than my drive to acquire. And I looked across the table and I said, nice move, kiddo. Thankfully, he screwed up and I ended up winning, but that's beside the point. The whole part of the story that's important is that I chose a different behavioral path, even though my thoughts, my feelings were not pro-social. They didn't come across that way. So do I think you can completely change? I think over the course of time, we can condition ourselves to be better, to think differently. The brain's neuroplastic. It can change. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Well, if I do things over and over again, eventually I can do them much easier as we move forward. I can make better choices. So while I might not be able to change how those thoughts and feelings washed over me, I can change my behavioral outcomes. And that's why we approach it from behavior, not necessarily trying to get you to change how you feel in those situations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know it makes total sense. And it's so true, because I'm thinking, there's times where, I'll be really frustrated, at customer service or something like that. And I turn around and the kids are there, and it's like, okay, what I would like to say or how I would like to react, that's not going to happen, because, that's setting a horrible example. Right. So it is like, as you were saying that, I'm like, it's funny how literally it's in your head, you're thinking it, but something else better come out.
Yes.
Right? To avoid a blow up, or to avoid something that, really doesn't need to be. And also the energy, I guess, that comes with, if I were to decide to not listen to my thoughts and act with my behavior, right? It's the energy that comes with it. And then usually there's no solution sometimes. And then you go on and you're huffing and puffing, right? So yeah.
Well, and not, we won't go so down the road of neuroscience, but we understand that the brain is very complex, right? We know that we have emotional regulation centers, we have fear, fight, flight, or faint responses, all done within our limbic system. But thankfully, while that is a fast system, and while it reacts very quickly, we still have our logical neocortex, which can override that. What we try to do is help people create space in between their feelings and their thoughts that allow them to think through of what is my better action. Because when we're reactive to that anger, or that frustration or sadness that kicks in, that's where we make stress decisions. And stress decisions typically are not as good as our decisions when we're not under stress. So trying to take a step back, and then think through logically. Look, we've all been in that situation where you've argued. I could be arguing with Brian and we're going back and forth, and I'm like, I'm done with this conversation. I walk and I get about 5 feet away, and I'm like, oh, I should have said this. I would have really got Brian if I said this. Or we've been in that situation where I said, ooh, I shouldn't have said that. I am sleeping on the couch because I said that. And we know that that's that transition between the emotional side of us and the logical side of us. And believe it or not, we have good control mechanisms in that logical side if we can learn to harness and take control over some of those other emotional things. We're still going to feel it. We're still going to be frustrated. We're still going to be angry, but we don't have to act that way.
So I guess, can you walk us through some practical steps?
Yeah.
Just to, and I don't know, maybe you pick a scenario and just to help us walk through and figure out how we would better deal with it.
Yeah, I'm going to give you the 2 easiest ones. And I'm telling you, we learned them in kindergarten. And believe it or not, there is very, very strong neuroscientific support for it. All right. So we got to start with controlling ourselves. The very first one is take a deep breath. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Like, and you're in the middle of an argument, you're in the middle of a fight. The first thing, when somebody's like, okay, calm down, Tanya, just take a deep breath. All you want to do is actually choke them at that point in time. Usually, that's never calmed down an argument. But the reality is when we get into that fight or flight mode, our brain thinks that we're running from a lion. We're running from our lives. Now, when we actually stop and slow down and take a deep breath, what we end up ironically doing is telling our brain that we're not running from the lion. Because imagine if you're taking a deep breath and you're running from a lion, it's going to be like, oh, there's a lion behind me. No, that's not how we do it, right? So actually introducing more oxygen into the system reduces the limbic reaction, slows things down a little bit. So taking a deep breath. Now, if you're in the middle of an argument, don't just sit there and go, because it's going to look really weird and they're going to think you're crazy. So the second strategy that we learned in kindergarten is counting to 10. Now, as adults, we do this a little bit differently, right? Because if you're standing there in front of somebody and you're arguing, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm still angry. As adults, how I like to communicate this is it's taking a recess. You know, Tanya, we are getting really into this, and I think it's a great conversation. Could we maybe take a few minutes? Let's go grab some water. I think this is really important to continue down, but I just want to take a moment so we can breathe and relax and then continue this conversation. Or if you're in a boardroom and somebody says that, idiotic thing or something that really just catches you off guard, literally counting in your brain 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000 before you speak. And even if by the time you get to 3 seconds, you're going to be smarter than you were in that immediate impact, right? So those are two very simple and have been shown through cognitive neuroscience to be very effective. But how do we get ourselves to implement those? Because it's when the emotion comes over us, that takes practice. That takes those situations of understanding what your triggers are, knowing what it is, or knowing who your triggers might be, because you might have some kind of poor relationship. And this is what we use. We call it the predict models. If you've ever maybe when you were first dating, one of you might have said something along the lines of, okay, listen, I'm going to introduce you to my brother, and he's probably going to say a few things that's just, just ignore. We can actually predict bad behaviors quite well. And when we do that, we can actually guard ourselves against, if this behavior occurs, I will count to 10. If this behavior occurs, I will take a deep breath and excuse myself. And we create these logical if-then statements to predict when those situations will occur. So that's kind of 2 tactics with a third one for implementation for you. But I mean, there's a number of different ways that we can really kind of get at the core of how do we manage ourselves, right?
Yeah, one thing that we hear, especially professionally, that we hear people talk about a lot is emotional intelligence. But how can we improve our behavioral intelligence?
Yeah, so for us, and I've studied emotional intelligence, and I'm certified in an emotional intelligence assessment. I think it's one of the most valuable things. But a lot of times when you say, hey, this is a situation requiring emotional intelligence, there's a subset of people that immediately will shut down. It's like, ooh, emotion, you just said emotions? No, I'm not going to deal with that right now. And what we have found is that when we come at it from a behavioral aspect, a lot of times that opens the door. So our behavioral intelligence model really has 4 key areas. 1, to be able to explain existing behaviors. So that's looking at things like the cognitive neuroscience of hormones, testosterone and how that plays, the dopamine circuit. Now, if you're an average user, you don't need to know all of those things. You are an expert in human behavior. Believe it or not, everyone is an expert. It's just really being like, okay, culturally, that's why that's occurring. Environmentally, that's why that's occurring. Stress-wise, that's why that's occurring. So being able to explain the existing behaviors, kind of step 1, really, it's the awareness of around us. Step 2 in behavioral intelligence is learning to predict. Human beings, we are habit creatures, right? Like if you look, I guarantee you can find 600 habits in your entire day. Some people say 60% of our behavior is habit related. So it's being able to predict patterns of behavior, seeing those patterns. What were the triggers that led to those, the stimuli that bring out specific reactions, responses. So that's the second pillar. Third pillar, being able to influence somebody else's behavior, understanding different aspects of influence. So that's not only just trust building or liking that people trust you and you are influential, but also how can I create a message that is persuasive, that might be an open door for somebody. Like, here's an example. If you've ever been in a situation where somebody's come up to you and just said, Brian, we need to talk. And you're like, oh my gosh, you might feel on your heels or defensive. But if I come to you and say, Brian, I noticed that we're having a huge issue in the office, and I'd really like to speak with you about how we might be able to move forward with that. That is a very different message and very different statement. No one likes getting the call from the boss. Can you please come down to my office? We need to talk. And then you get down there and he's like, do you want red pens or blue pens? And in the meantime, the 8 seconds that it took you to get there, you thought you were getting fired. So simple ways of being more influential and more purposeful with our behavior is a very powerful way to ethically reduce some of these conflict things. And then the last section of behavioral intelligence is that control manifestation. It's learning when we have a reaction to something and being able to create the space between thoughts, feelings, and then the thoughts plus feelings equals behavior. We want to make that equal sign as big as possible so we can make the best possible behavioral choices.
It makes total sense. I'm just thinking too, a lot of people, especially, I don't know, maybe with the rush of today's society, we just want to know if there's a problem, can you have a solution? Right? Because if you have a problem with me as a coworker, let's come up with a solution, right? It's not just getting stopped at, here's the problem, nobody knows what to do, right?
You know, sometimes I think difficult behaviors and difficult people are almost a little like the old movie Sixth Sense. Do you ever see that movie, Abe?
Yeah.
It's almost like you feel like you're Haley Joel Osment in the bed going, I see difficult people. They're everywhere. They don't even know that they're difficult. And sometimes, and this is again where research, full circle becomes me search, is I learned that I was a very difficult person for some people to deal with. I thought I was confident. I thought I was, just fun and so on and so forth. But then I realized through business, through different interactions, then maybe it's not coming off as confident. Maybe it's coming off as arrogant, which is literally 100% of the way that I never wanted to be perceived. I've never thought I was better than somebody. Do I have confidence? Absolutely. But my confidence was perceived by someone else as arrogance. And when I had that conversation with the person, when they had the courage to bring that to me, like, I really thought you were arrogant. I didn't know you serve on nonprofit boards. I didn't know that you do a whole bunch of charity. I didn't know that you take care of all of these different things. And they were like, you're a very different person than I expected you to be. That resonated with me. And I was grateful that they had the courage to speak with me on that, because then it made me understand of, if that person perceives me in this way, other people might too. And I need to dial that back. I need to maybe pull that confidence back, that assertiveness or willingness to engage, and just sometimes shut my mouth and listen. And that's a great lesson for dealing with difficult people.
So behavior, I would love to get your point of view on this one. Do you think behavior can be the key to success or to failure?
Yes. So I think that if you look, each human being on average makes nearly 30,000 decisions every single day. And it's exhausting, right? By the time you hit bed, you are tired. But each one of those decisions has further consequences. They may have consequences on your own mood, your own attitude, your feelings. It may have consequences on the people that are around you. Humans are social people, and how we choose to behave not only impacts us internally from the neurobiology perspective, but if you've ever walked into a room where two people were arguing and you didn't even hear them, but you could sense it, like you knew that there was a fight there. Well, guess what? How we portray ourselves, people know if we're having that bad day, if we're having a frustrating day. People can see and sense our emotions because of things called mirror neurons. So when we think about the decisions that we make or those different behaviors each and every day, how I choose to portray myself, how I choose to feel, how I choose to act and manifest the behaviors that might be underlying that sort of emotional context, or the idea context, that is going to have an impact not only on me, but the person sitting across from me. And then their reaction is going to have an impact on me. And then my reaction is going to have an impact on them. I have worked very, very hard to try to change the choices of my behavior, to try to be uplifting, to try to be empowering, to try to always give somebody the benefit of the doubt. It's not always easy, and I fail sometimes. There's sometimes I'm like, wow, there is literally nothing on this planet that can excuse what you just did. Nothing. And I feel that way, right? So it's a human complexity. It's not something that's always easy. But I look at it and say, how I choose to behave ultimately will impact the way that you behave, which will then impact the way that I behave, which will then impact the way that you behave. And if one of us, two of us, three of us really try to take that into consideration, imagine the ripple effect that we can create in our offices, in our homes, in our relationships, in our friendships, in all of the places that we as human beings play together. And I think that that's something that's really powerful. And I think it's a mission worth pursuing.
Mm-hmm. And, especially as you said that, I think also of like people who are in leadership roles, or, as parents, right? They say kids will feed off of, especially mom, how mom's doing that day, her mood and all that kind of stuff, right? It's the same for the boss. If boss comes in and, they're miserable, then that's really gonna throw the whole team that's there trying to do their job, right? So very true.
Yeah, it's impressive how impactful we are in our behavior, because sometimes we just think that we're on our own little island, and that's part of some of our neuropsychology, is that we tend to forget everybody else has emotions and feelings, and it's really about us sometimes. And when we can learn to kind of take a step back from that, we realize that we are really all in this together, and everyone's mood collectively creates a culture. And if you're not intentionally working towards creating a positive culture, a culture will form and manifest. So if you are in a leadership position and you find yourself in a culture that's negative, or if you find yourself in a culture that is behaviorally negative consequence focused, well, at that point in time, it's time for you as the leader to start recreating that culture. And you'll do that by the actions that people see, that people hear, and that people interact with, i.e., your behaviors. So that's really where that comes from. But yeah, I definitely have walked into the kitchen at one point in time when mom was not having a good day, and whew, yep, I could feel it as hot as the stove.
Now, one thing that you mentioned, I just kind of want to circle back to, was decision making. And there's been some studies that show that we have a limited capacity for making decisions on a daily basis. And I guess when you look at some of high performers like a Steve Jobs or a Mark Zuckerberg, for example, one of the things they do is they just wear the same thing every day, so it's one less thing they have to decide. For myself, I wasn't willing to go that route when I had to go into an office, so I used to just, on Sunday, I would have all my clothes out for the week, so every day I just grabbed what I had to grab. Do you think there's a benefit to limiting the amount of decisions you have to make with some of that small stuff?
Yeah, and I love that you asked that, Brian, because that is actually something when I do habits training, you use the exact solution. Like, okay, in the middle of the week, I'm not going to have the cognitive capacity to sit down and plan this out or make my lunches in advance or anything else. So I'm just going to grab fast food because I'm going to make an easy, quick decision, even though I know that that's not the best decision for me to make. So on Sunday, I might prepare my salads and lunches when I'm in a high motivation space, when I have high cognitive capacity. I might try to preload a number of those decisions, whether it's getting dressed or choosing your outfits or anything else. Unfortunately, the studies, and a lot of the studies shown, a cognitive sort of depletion from decision making is oftentimes in the criminal justice system, and people seeking probation. God forbid your probation meeting is scheduled at the end of the day, or that it's scheduled multiple hours after eating. And it's, the science is there. It's pretty clear we have very different capacities. And some of the work by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, their sort of seminal book, Kahneman's book, but the work of him and Amos Tversky together sort of created some of those. But those biases, we allow them to slip into our lives when we're not at our thoughtful, strategic, cerebral self. And really, anything that you can automate or anything that you can preload in advance does help to take some of that cognitive burden. So like when we're talking about managing burnout, one of the other trainings that I do, especially within the healthcare industry, we teach them, here's all the things that you could be doing on your second day of your 2 days off. Here's what you can do to try to automate these. Here's some technology or some apps that you can use that'll give you behavioral prompts, or that'll give you reminders towards the things that you really want to achieve. So yes, decision fatigue is a very, very real thing. It is well documented, and it can have absolutely devastating consequences. So when we are thinking as leaders, or even as people within the family, if I can reduce that cognitive load, we're much more likely to make the right choices at the right time.
Now, one last thing is, you brought up another thing that is interesting to me, is some of those apps or some of those prompts that people could set up just to remind them of those specific behaviors. What are like the top couple that you would share with someone?
Yeah, so one of the easiest ones, and what I try to do with some of the different technologies are what are the most accessible technologies? Almost everybody has Google Calendar in their calendar. Now, if you're not ready to go the route of time blocking where you're like booking out all 15 minutes of your day, if you're not there, set yourself some kind of scheduled reminder to take a 10-minute break. And an intentional 10-minute break, right? Because we sometimes have a 10-minute break during the day and we flip over to Facebook or TikTok. That's not the kind of break I'm talking about. I'm talking about an actual sitting quietly with yourself, with your thoughts type break. You will have some behavioral awareness that comes to you in that space. You'll have some time to reflect on earlier decisions, but you'll actually bring your cognitive capacity back up. So something simple like scheduling little events on your calendars, just so that way you get some kind of prompt, is a great strategy, and everybody has that on their phone. Other ones I really like. I do like something like the Calm app, and there's a whole bunch of other meditation, mindset apps. I'll set a trigger for that to give me a daily notification like, hey, you missed your morning session. That's a great one because that tells me, all right, I got to do, X, Y, or Z. Other things that I use from a productivity standpoint, there's a wonderful, wonderful tool called Todoist. And you can download it on your phone, you can have it on your computer, you can get the app for it, but that oftentimes gives me a little daily reminder of my to-do list. And usually I try to keep like, what are my 3 major goals for the day? And those are what I'm trying to accomplish. So little technologies like that, just kind of giving yourself a behavioral nudge every now and then is enough to be like, oh, I'm a mouse and I want the cheese. That's really all we need to do is just give us, oh yeah, there's cheese at the end of this. I just need to remember to go after it. So.
Okay, I like those practical ways. It's what we need.
Now, in terms of anything that you may have on the go right now, anything that we can look forward to in the future, or just even ways to connect with you, what can you share about any of that?
Yeah, so our behavioral elements program, we do an entire assessment with the program. So that is available on the market right now. You can actually get measured in your drive to acquire, your drive to bond, drive to defend, and drive to learn. You can find that at behavioralelements.com. We do have a very quick free version that you can take, and it'll tell you what your primary element is. And then we also have the paid version, which is a 27-page report that comes with it with how do I interact with other elements? How do I manage my style versus somebody else's style? So those are some of the big things that we're pushing right now. I'm very excited, as one of the things that we have been doing is working with a lot of companies, a lot of governments, to try to help them to understand their behavioral culture. So more articles are going to be coming out of that. We're doing some research, and that'll be exciting. But to get a hold of me, you can reach out through the behavioralelements.com website, or by all means, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm all over that space as well. But those would be probably the easiest ways to get to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for making the time today, Jay. We appreciate it. And again, just another great conversation with lots of valuable insights.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Tanya. It's been my absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. For more ways to listen, connect with us on social media. To be a guest or to partner with us, check out our link tree at Disrupt the Everyday. Join us next time for more ways to disrupt the everyday.